The fall of Rome was not a sudden event, but a process that took centuries to develop. Although Rome had established itself as the center of a vast empire, the first signs of its fall appeared when the borders of the Roman Empire began to be attacked by barbarian peoples who were pressing in search of new lands and resources. These people, although initially viewed as savages, played a crucial role in the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. Throughout the 3rd and 4th centuries, barbarians began to invade Roman borders, especially in the north and east of the empire. The Visigoths, Vandals, Ostrogoths, Franks and Huns were some of the most well-known groups that besieged the Roman walls. The famous invasion of the Huns, led by Attila, was especially significant. Attila, known as the Scourge of God, ravaged Roman territories in the east and west, creating an atmosphere of terror throughout the empire. However, before great names like Attila arrived at the gates of Rome, other barbarian peoples had already begun to establish themselves on the borders of the empire. In 376 AD, the Visigoths were pushed back into the Eastern Roman Empire due to pressure from the Huns. In an attempt to find refuge, the Visigoths crossed the Danube River and asked permission to settle within Roman borders. Although they were initially welcomed, tensions between the Visigoths and the Romans quickly increased, culminating in the sack of Adrianople in 378 AD, a devastating blow to the Roman army. What began as a series of raids on the empire's borders became a series of increasingly organized and powerful invasions. The Romans, preoccupied with their own internal weakening, were unable to effectively confront these attacks. The Vandals, for example, not only invaded North Africa, but even sacked the city of Rome itself in 455 AD. After centuries of imperial expansion, Rome, caught between its own internal problems and waves of barbarian invasions, began to lose control of vast territories. The fall of the borders was not only a military blow, but also a psychological one. The idea that Roman power was invulnerable began to crumble among the citizens themselves, who saw how the invaders crossed their borders without the empire being able to do anything to stop them. The barbarian invasions marked the beginning of the end of the Western Roman Empire, which began to fragment and weaken further as the invaders gained territory, wealth, and power. As barbarian hordes began to invade Rome's borders, the true weakness of the Western Roman Empire lay in its very foundations. Internal corruption was a key factor that decisively contributed to the fall of Rome. As the empire expanded, so did the Roman bureaucracy and ruling class, but with it also grew corruption, waste, and political instability. One of the main problems was the excessive desire for power among the emperors and their courtiers. Emperors were often elected or overthrown by factions within the army or senate, resulting in constant internal power struggles. This political instability prevented coherent governance, and many emperors were not interested in the needs of the people or the well-being of the empire, but in maintaining their own power and wealth. Administrative corruption was rampant. Roman government officials, from procurators to high-ranking officials, they enriched themselves at the expense of the empire's coffers. Bribes were demanded for everything from the assignment of positions to the resolution of legal disputes. The tax system was riddled with abuse, and provinces were plundered to line the rulers' pockets. This not only impoverished the population, but also generated distrust and resentment toward the government. The militarization of the empire also had negative effects. Although the Roman army had been the pillar of its power for centuries, in the later years of the empire, Roman soldiers became more loyal to their commanders than to the empire itself. Emperors paid soldiers with large amounts of money and land, which allowed them to gain political power through their armies. This situation led to a vicious cycle of subordination and disloyalty, where the army, instead of being a unified force serving Rome, became a political instrument in the hands of ambitious generals. The Roman government's excessive spending, coupled with an increasingly weak economy, left the empire unable to stay afloat. Inflation was rampant, and the Roman monetary system collapsed, leading to a devaluation of the currency and a drop in people's purchasing power. The Roman state was forced to resort to higher taxes, which further affected ordinary Roman citizens, who were already living under great hardship. Moral decay also played a significant role. As the Romans sank into luxury and hedonism, the values that had enabled the empire to rise, such as discipline, sacrifice, and civic duty, were diluted. Instead, a culture of excess and corruption emerged, discouraging younger generations from defending the empire and contributing to Rome's well-being. Internal corruption was a cancer that slowly ate away at the very core of the Western Roman Empire. As the empire bled dry from outside invasions, its own leaders contributed to its downfall. Disregarding the well-being of the people and the future of the empire in exchange for immediate power and wealth. On August 24, 410 AD, Rome, the city that had been the center of a vast empire for centuries, suffered a blow no one would have imagined. The Visigoths, led by King Alaric I, sacked Rome. This event was one of the most devastating moments in the history of the Western Roman Empire, marking a point of no return for its inevitable collapse. Rome had never been sacked in its history since it was founded, and the fact that such an imposing city was vulnerable to Visigoth invasion surprised many. Although the empire was already weakened by decades of internal corruption and barbarian pressure on the borders, the plundering by the Visigoths left an indelible mark on the Roman psyche. Alaric, the Visigoth leader, had not been a minor enemy. For years, the Visigoths had pressed the borders of the empire, seeking refuge in Roman territory. But the lack of agreements and the poor decisions of the Roman emperors eventually led to an unsustainable situation. By 408 AD, the Visigoths had approached the walls of Rome, demanding food, gold, and territories, and in that same year, Rome paid a huge ransom to prevent an attack. However, this truce did not last long, and in 410 AD, Alaric, fed up with the broken promises and corruption of the Roman government, decided to take the city. The sack of Rome was brutal. For 3 days, the Visigoths plundered the city, taking everything they could: gold, silver, precious objects, works of art, and even slaves. The loot was incalculable, and the sight of the Visigoths ravaging a city that for centuries had been a symbol of power and greatness was a mortal blow to the empire. But the most symbolic aspect of this plunder was not just the material plunder, but the psychological impact. For the Romans, Rome was the capital of the world. The idea that their eternal city could be taken by barbarian peoples was unthinkable. The image of a sacked Rome was devastating to the morale of the Roman citizens and elite. The city had fallen, and with it, much of the confidence in the empire's invulnerability. Although the Eastern Roman Empire, the eastern part of the empire, with its capital in Constantinople, remained strong. The fall of Rome represented the loss of the capital of the Western Empire. Although Alaric did not completely destroy Rome, the sack destroyed its symbolism, which had been fundamental to the empire's power for centuries. The sack of Rome by the Visigoths was a brutal reminder that Rome was no longer the superpower it had been. The shock of this invasion, the public humiliation, and the collapse of Roman institutions at the political and military levels accelerated the process of decomposition of the Western Roman Empire. One of the key factors in the fall of the Western Roman Empire was the strategic decision to divide the empire into two parts, the western part and the eastern part. This act, carried out by the Emperor Diocletian in the year 285 AD, was initially intended as a way to make the vast Roman territory more manageable, which stretched from the British Isles to North Africa, and from the Iberian Peninsula to Mesopotamia. However, over time, this division weakened the empire irreversibly. Diocletian, realizing the immensity of the task of governing the empire alone, decided to divide the administration into two parts, each under an emperor, the Emperor of the West and the Emperor of the East. Thus were born the two halves of the Roman Empire, one with its capital in Rome, later in Ravenna, and the other with its capital in Byzantium, later known as Constantinople, in present-day Turkey. The idea was that each emperor could focus on the immediate threats facing his part of the empire, allowing for a more effective response. Although the division of the empire seemed logical at first, it soon became a problem. Competition between the two halves of the empire increased, and cultural and political differences between Rome and its western provinces. Byzantium, with its growing economic and military power, became more pronounced. As barbarian invasions intensified in the west, the Western Roman Empire became increasingly weakened, while the Eastern Roman Empire prospered. The East was more prosperous, better organized, and in many ways more stable, which led to a growing disconnect between the two halves. Meanwhile, the Western emperors were unable to cope with the many external threats that threatened them. Barbarians were pressing on the borders of the Western Roman Empire, and civil wars within the empire only made matters worse. In contrast, in the East, Constantinople remained relatively safe, with its imposing walls and prosperous trade. The political and cultural estrangement between the two halves of the empire led to a gradual weakening of Roman unity. The division of the empire also caused internal political weakness. While the Eastern Roman Empire, with its capital in Constantinople, managed to survive for another 1,000 years, the Western Roman Empire was caught between barbarian attacks and its own internal problems. Attempts to restore imperial unity were mostly ineffective, and the two halves of the empire never became truly strong again. Ultimately, this division was one of the most important factors in the fall of the Western Roman Empire. The lack of cohesion, the weakening of central authority, and the rise of an Eastern Empire that no longer saw Rome as its equal sealed the fate of the Western part. The unity that once allowed Rome to dominate the known world crumbled, and with it, Roman power in the West. On September 4, 476 AD, the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus. He was deposed by the barbarian leader Odoacer, officially marking the end of the Western Roman Empire. Although the Roman Empire did not immediately disintegrate entirely, the deposition of Romulus Augustulus is considered one of the most symbolic moments of the fall of Rome. It was the close of an era that had lasted more than 500 years, since the founding of Rome in 753 BC. Romulus Augustulus, whose name reflects Roman imperial tradition, was a young emperor, probably a puppet in the hands of the military factions that controlled the empire. His reign was brief, lasting only 3 years, and although his title was formally emperor, the reality was that he had no real power. The empire was in ruins, divided, invaded, and ruled by generals who were more loyal to their own ambitions than to imperial unity. In many ways, Romulus Augustulus was nothing more than a symbol of the decline of an empire that no longer had strength or stability. The fall of Romulus Augustulus was not an unexpected event. Throughout the 5th century, the Western Roman Empire had been ruled by a series of weak emperors, unable to resist growing external and internal pressures. The barbarian invasions had left the empire vulnerable, and the Romans themselves failed to unify their efforts to defend their territory. In 476 AD, Odoacer, leader of the Heruli, a Germanic tribe located in northern Italy, deposed Romulus Augustulus. And instead of installing a new emperor, Odoacer proclaimed himself king of Italy. This act of deposition symbolized the end of Roman imperial power in the West. Although the Romans never stopped considering Rome as the capital of their world, the truth is that Rome was no longer the capital of the empire. And the center of power shifted permanently to the east, toward Byzantium, Constantinople, which continued as the center of the Eastern Roman Empire, later known as the Byzantine Empire. The Western Roman Empire no longer existed, and the city of Rome became a shadow of what it had been. The fall of Rome was a long and complex process, marked by barbarian invasions, internal corruption, and political decline. But the final act, the deposition of Romulus Augustulus, marked the end of one of the most powerful civilizations humanity has ever known. Rome ceased to be the capital of the known world, and the Western Roman Empire ceased to exist, although its legacy lived on through its cultural, legal, and architectural influence throughout the world. The fall of Rome, however, did not mean the end of Roman influence in Europe. The Eastern Roman Empire, known as the Byzantine Empire, survived until 1453, and many Roman institutions, laws, and traditions remained alive throughout the Middle Ages. Furthermore, Rome's cultural legacy left an indelible mark on Western history, and the name Rome would continue to resonate as a symbol of power, culture, and civilization.